Hi, this is Mike Stevenson. Welcome to this video about real-world projects with Windows Azure BizTalk Services. In these videos I aim to do a series of different ideas about how we may use BizTalk Services for real-world projects. This first video is going to cover some early thoughts about how we might do things and what the rest of this series might include. I'm sure I'll have already met many of the people who'll be watching this video, but in case not, here's a little bit about me. So I've been a Microsoft Integration MVP or BizTalk MVP for a number of years now, and I've done many community activities around user groups, presentations and community projects. One of the main ones I've done recently is the BizTalk Maturity Assessment, and I've also authored a couple of Pluralsight courses. There's some contact details for me on this slide as well, so please feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk about these or any other topics. Now to the main part of the video. Windows Azure BizTalk Services has recently had its second release and offers BizTalk as platform as a service on Windows Azure. With the second release there's been some extra features added which makes BizTalk Services something for teams to really consider when developing new projects for integration. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is how teams can use technology in the real world, not just for samples that make them technology look cool, but actually can we deliver real projects and solve real business problems with these tools. And I think that takes the development to an additional level, and the things that I'm really interested in are, can we work as a team with this technology, can we do automated deployment, can we do effective configuration management, can we do automated testing, and can we create an effective development process. Now I'm a big believer that in your project you may have the perfect architecture or you may have an architecture that has some issues, but these types of solutions can still be delivered successfully if you have an effective process for each of these areas I've just identified. What you often find though is many of the projects where they have real problems are usually struggling in some of these areas, so that this whole sort of application lifecycle management piece is one of the most critical things that you as a development team can do to make sure your project would be successful. When we look at this new BizTalk Services technology, if we think back to the original days of BizTalk Server when it very first came out, it took a couple of years for teams to really start to understand how to develop solutions effectively and to get some level of maturity around the ALM piece. And with this technology now, being something teams are going to probably start using a lot more, I thought it was a good time to look at what can we do now, what types of areas should Microsoft look to improve the product, and what way should we be working. So in today's video I'm really going to focus on the build and deploy aspect of what I've just talked about, and this video is probably going to be a little bit rough and ready, and it's really some early thinking about what kind of things we can do and what kind of things we should be looking to do in the future. I'm going to make this quite demo focused, but kind of just bear with me if it's a little bit rough and ready, because this is the first shot of this video in the series, and what I'll probably do is come back a little bit later on when I've actually done some more real world stuff with it and kind of find out what techniques seem to work best in practice and what ones maybe don't. But let's jump in and have a look at what we can do right now. So starting the demo, and let's have a quick look in the Windows Azure portal, and you can see that I've already created a BizTalk Services instance here, and it's really just a vanilla setup as per most of the setup documentation. And if we just let that load up, and you can see there's nothing particularly special about it, a few bits and pieces here. However, if I also open up the Windows Azure BizTalk Services portal, and you can have a little look in here and see I've got my everything that a sort of empty project's going to have: no partners, no agreements, no bridges or anything yet, and it's really just ready for me to start development now. And if we jump over to Visual Studio, you can see here I've got a a sample project which I've called acme.wabs, and we'll pretend this is a project where Acme are going to be developing their first BizTalk Services project. In this project I've got two BizTalk Services type solutions. The first one contains various artifacts for BizTalk Services, such as schemas, maps, and the itinerary designer. I've also got a utilities project where I've got some C# classes that I'm going to reference from my bridges. I'll probably go into the detail of these solutions in a future video where I'll talk about some of the patterns I've been trying out. But for the moment, let's take a quick look at the itinerary so you can see what this solution's about. And if you look here, you can see we've got two bridges. So the first bridge is called Validate Claims, and this bridge at the top here would take a message off a service bus queue, run it through the bridge, and put it on a service bus outbound queue. And the second bridge we've got here is one which is an XML request response bridge, and that's going to accept a message, call a service bus relay endpoint, and then return the response back out. Inside these bridges there's a few things going on, nothing particularly complex at this stage. And you can see here this is pretty vanilla, and in the request reply bridge you can see I've got a couple of messages coming in. I've got some transforms in the middle here, and then it's going to call that destination. So nothing too complex, but a nice one to start playing around with the build process. Now, if you happen to have worked on one of my teams before, you'll kind of recognise the structure to how I've set up a build process here, and the actual solution itself. So I've also got a testing folder where I've got some acceptance tests, which I'll talk about in a future video, and we probably put some unit tests and things like that in there. We've got a build folder. Now in the build folder, in the real world this probably wouldn't be in my solution, but for simplicity with this early thinking, I've just got a couple of tools that I've been working on that'll help me develop the build process. So we've got one called WABs Packaging and one called WABs PowerShell, and what I intend to do is to put them out on maybe CodePlex or Visual Studio Samples or something like that, and just share with people you know what I've done with those, and let's get some feedback to see if they work. And the idea is the packaging tool would create a deployment package from your Visual Studio solution, which you can then deploy to BizTalk Services. And the PowerShell project just contains some extra PowerShell commandlets that I've used in the build process, which don't come out of the box with the PowerShell stuff from Microsoft. We'll talk through those a little bit more in a moment. And now the key thing is the solution items folder and the build directory under there. So if we start by having a look at build.proj, and if you remember, the aim here is I've got this new Visual Studio solution from source control, for example, and I want to basically run the build and have this deployed to Visual Studio, my compiled code, which I can then run some acceptance tests against. And a normal process might be, well, I want to have a package that comes at the end of my build, and I can take that package and deploy it to any other environment. That's a pretty standard thing we do in most development processes. So if we start by looking at this build here, and you can see we've got a target called full build. And in this target, one of the aims here is to keep the build script fairly self-explanatory. So there's a number of stages to it. We'll start by running a cleanup script, and that'll tear down anything from a previous build that might have been left over and get us to a nice clean starting point. We'll then run pre-build setup, which will create any folders or dependencies we need, or any other just setup before we do the build. The build itself will compile the Visual Studio solution and make sure everything runs okay. We'll then package the output, and this basically means we're going to take all those BizTalk Services artifacts and create the deployment package that we can deploy to any environment. We're then going to do the deployment activity, which will actually push that deployment package up into BizTalk Services, set everything up and have our bridges up and running and ready to build, ready to work with. And then unit testing is a way of just executing a whole bunch of unit tests and acceptance tests that'll make sure everything's running okay. So let's now have a look at the details, starting with the clean task. So in this particular build, I've got a couple of things to start with, which are taking the test results folder that Visual Studio creates, and if it's still there from the last build, I'll delete it. In the build, we have a folder called output, which is where we create the deployment package, and if that's there from an old build, I'll delete that as well. And also, one of the things we often do is we'll zip that output package up into a zip file that we can then take to our deployment tool. So in previous projects, I've often worked with a tool called Nolio, which I think's recently been bought out by CA, and it's a release automation tool. And what we used to do was deliver our BizTalk packages as zip files containing things like an MSI and binding files and all the things that people are used to, and then we would use Nolio to sort of push that out to environments and have a whole holistic piece on top of that. So that's the kind of thing that I want to encourage teams to be able to do. And so I'm going to kind of, with BizTalk Services, try to follow a deployment process that'll meet all of those good standards that we've done in the past. Next, we've got a little hack in the build here. So one of the things that I noticed was, and I'll just demonstrate that, there's probably a little bug with BizTalk Services. If we build that project that's got the wabs.services project in it, and then we go and have a look on the file system, and you can see in the bin directory you get these files here which have got just a GUID file name. And one of the things I found that was a little bit of an annoyance was if you build it again, if we just give that a second to build, you seem to get another GUID file name, and then do it again, you seem to get another one. So you can see now I've got 3 of these files, and I don't really know what they do. They don't really seem to have any impact on the solution at all, so I assume it's some kind of temp file. And what I've done here is just to keep things nice and tidy, before we do a proper build, we'll just go and clean out that bin directory for the BizTalk Services project and just get rid of any old rubbish that's in there. Then the next thing to do is we're gonna clean all of the old artifacts in the WABs instance. So if you remember, in the portal we've got nothing in there already, but what happens if we were doing some work a couple of hours ago and we had everything all set up? Before we go and do a deployment, we want to just take it down to a completely clean state. And if you think as a development team, you might have a couple of a couple of different projects in Visual Studio that you're working on at the same time, and what you might want to do is you might work on one project and then you go to work on a second one, and you need to make sure WABs is clean between those projects so you don't really get any sort of unexpected test results. And how we handle that in the solution is I've got a cleanup script here, and what you can see is that we've got a couple of modules that we import. One of them's the default BizTalk module, one of them's the custom PowerShell stuff I've wrote. Then we just basically get the current path. We've got a little bit of detail about the BizTalk Services instance, so we've got the ACS name, the issuer, the key, and then I've got this new command that I've written called remove Azure BizTalk artifacts, and basically that's going to clean the whole instance out. Now at the minute I've really been focusing on the EAI side of things, so I haven't really covered any of the EDI, Edifact or partner type stuff. It's really going to clean out all of your bridges, all of your schemas and stuff, and we can have a quick look at that up here. So the remove all BizTalk artifacts, as you can see here, we're going to delete the schemas, delete the transforms, delete certificates, delete assemblies, delete bridges, and I'll probably extend this in the future, but for now that kind of just gets it to a nice clean state. Then I've got some comments in here. So in my sample project I'm working on, I'm doing a little bit of stuff with service bus as well. So I've got some receive and send queues, and what I'd probably do in the real world is have something in here which sets up queues in the build script, because this would be a dependency on the project. So I'd probably run it, spin a couple of queues up in the cloud, clean them up after I'm finished, maybe do the same with it, service bus namespace even. And the point here is that you'd have some customization of this script to do any bits that are specific to your project, but generally the stuff above would be quite generic. The stuff I've highlighted would be generic to most projects. The next step is pre-build setup. So usually for most projects I'd have some kind of output folder structure that I'd build, where we'd create the package directory, which is the thing that we can deploy to any environment. So we create the output directory, create the utilities, create the power, the folder where the PowerShell stuff's going to go, because I'm going to use that when I'm deploying. And I've got this directory called WABs artifacts, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then again, if I was taking this a little bit further, I'd probably do the queue setup for later in the build and stuff like that. The next stage is the actual build itself. So here I'm just going to use the MS build target, reference the solution file, and get it to compile that solution for me. The next stage was package. So here I'm going to create the deployment package, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reference my packaging tool that I've built called appfx.wabs.packaging.exe, and I'm going to pass in a reference to a config file. Now, this is me playing around a bit with how we might do it. It seems to work really well, but this is the bit I'm really interested in. What other people are doing, to see if anyone's got a much better way of doing it. And the key thing here is in the solution here, you can see I've got this XML file, and this is going to give me some information about my solution, my project. So to begin with, I've got references to where some PowerShell stuff is. So where's the BizTalk PowerShell going to be installed? I think that's my custom PowerShell. Oh, sorry, where's my output PowerShell script going to be? So if you imagine, when I run this, I'm going to take all of the artifacts, put them into a folder structure, and create a PowerShell script that can deploy them to any environment, and that's where the PowerShell script's going to be. So that's actually going to go in my output folder. And I've got some details about the WABs instance that I want it to deploy to, and here we've got the BizTalk Services URL, access control namespace, and all that kind of stuff. And what I'd probably do when we take this further is I'd probably parameterize this file so that I can inject stuff in for different environments and stuff like that. The root directory is an interesting one. So this is basically going to be the folder where we'll start the tool searching for things that look like WABs artifacts, and it's going to recursively search that folder and just package up anything that looks like a WABs artifact. And the output for that's going to be in this parameter here, which is the packaging directory, and we can specify a configuration mode which will tell us whether it's a debug or a release build. I've got in some parameters about the file extensions to identify WABs artifacts. So we've got XSDs, transforms, assemblies, bridge extensions. So if you look under the hood on the file system, some people may not have seen this yet, but you've got this validate claim bridge.pipeline.atom, and that's actually something you can deploy to actually create the bridge the way you want it. And then the same for the artifacts. So you've got these artifact.atom. I don't really, if I remember right, I don't think I really actually use those yet, but they seem to be part of the packaging process from the BizTalk Services Visual Studio setup. So we're just packaging them up, and we may use them later. I've got so just to make the packaging a bit quicker, there's a couple of folders here I've specified that I just want it to ignore. So when it recursively searches that that directory, you know, there's no point in searching any of the packaging folders or the acceptance tests or anything like that. And also I can specify the names of certain folders, so if I come across any folders with any of these names, I'll just ignore them because I know there's nothing in them. So it just makes it a little bit tighter about what it packages and, you know, which folders it searches. And going back to the build, so we execute that file and it'll produce the package, and then we'll copy this line here is about copying the PowerShell script, the PowerShell commands to the utilities folder within the output package, and then we're going to use the MS Build extension pack and just zip that folder up so we can take that and deploy it anywhere. The next stage before we run the unit test is deploy. So I've got in that output folder there's going to be a PowerShell script that'll get generated, and I can basically call that PowerShell script from MS Build, and it's going to deploy everything to BizTalk Services in advance of me running my unit tests. And then finally we've got a couple of targets here that'll go through the solution, look for any projects that have a naming convention that indicates it probably includes tests, and then we're going to run them here and get our results. So I'm going to run through that now and just show you what happens, with a slight caveat here that I'm still working on the unit tests, so they don't fully work at the minute. Some of them do, some of them don't. However, I'm going to come back to those in a later video, and really just for the minute I want this early thinking about the build process. Also note at this point that I haven't really touched on configuration management yet, so I think that'll be one of the challenges with BizTalk Services as to how we configure different things to go with different environments. But I think once we've got this package structure with some PowerShell, it becomes quite easy to manipulate that through the build. So if we jump into the file system now and we go back to the sample folder, and you can see here we haven't got, I'll just get rid of that test results folder. So this is what it would look like completely clean. And if we run the build.debug file now, you can see that pops open. It's already starting to run the build. You can see we've got our output folders created down here. You can see here now it's running that deployment script, so you're successfully deploying artifacts to BizTalk Services. And some of these artifacts take a little bit longer than others to deploy, but if you just give that a moment or two to run through. And actually, while that's running, what we'll do is we'll now jump into the output folder, and this is what was created by the build process. And you can see in the utilities we've got this PowerShell stuff that we've been creating here, and also we've got the WABs artifacts. So we start with the artifacts, which is just a bunch of Atom files that were in the solution. And as I said earlier, I'm not convinced with whether we need these or not yet, but they were there. They look like they might be useful at some point. We've got all the assemblies that were referenced by the WABs project. So one of the interesting questions here is things like Microsoft.BizTalk.Services and Service Bus DLLs were copied into that bin directory, but do we need to deploy those or not? So, you know, you would assume if we were deploying to a local directory somewhere, maybe, you know, if this was hosted in like an app pool in IIS, you'd need those in the bin directory. But with BizTalk Services, maybe we do, maybe we don't. So for the minute I'm just including them, and they deploy and they seem to work fine, but maybe that's something where we need a bit of guidance in the future for. We've then got our bridges files, so if anyone's never seen these before, you can open it up and it's just a config file, and you know, it's got a whole bunch of stuff in here like WCF stuff and some custom bits and pieces. And we've got our schemas, and finally the transforms. And the deployment manifest, now this was actually This was actually created by the packaging tool that I showed you earlier, and what this is doing is, as it's searched through the structure and copied files to certain places, build up a load of information about the structure and the files that we've created in this path. And the idea here is that this was the input for creating the PowerShell script. So you can see we've got a whole bunch of schema files, we've got a whole bunch of bridge files and all that kind of stuff. And what I might do is I might modify the tool so that you could go in and change the deployment manifest and rerun just the PowerShell part of it rather than the whole thing in one go, but I'll have a little bit of a think about that. And then the PowerShell script itself, just let that open up in PowerShell and bring that across, and you can see here, hopefully people generally like this PowerShell. So we've got, get the import the PowerShell DLLs that we've got. So there's my custom one and the Microsoft one. Set our BizTalk Services variables here, and then we start off by adding the schemas, adding the transforms, adding the assemblies, and then create the bridge. And if you notice, the create bridge is a custom PowerShell command that I've written, because the default Microsoft one, it doesn't exist yet in that PowerShell DLL, but I've basically created it by having a look at how they do some of the work with the API, and it seems to work okay. If we jump back now, you see hopefully the build script went right through, deployed everything, and got an error when it was running the tests. But as I said, I'm currently still working on the tests, and I really just want to get some early feedback on the process up to this point. And if we have a look in the in BizTalk Services now, so if we do a bit of a refresh here, and you can see we've now got our 2 bridges deployed that I mentioned earlier. And if we go into the resources, you can see we've got our schemas, transforms and assemblies, and we could have now continued to run some tests, and hopefully this would just all magically work. So as a quick summary, having a look through the approach to how we might tackle this, developing real-world projects with BizTalk Services, a lot of the things that we would want to be able to do seem to be kind of doable. As I say, this is early thinking, so I need to play with this a bit more, find out if all of the things I'd like to do are there. I guess my one feeling so far is the configuration management might be one of the challenges, but with a little bit of work you could see I could do the automated build stuff quite effectively, and that output folder, which we then would zip up, I can take that and I'd just change the PowerShell script, and I mean, if we even take a quick look back at that, if we take a quick look, so we open that with Notepad, for example, I could take this folder and just change these parameters for BizTalk here and maybe the import modules, and I could pretty much just deploy it to any BizTalk Services instance. So that's pretty powerful. That's the kind of place we want to be with this this approach for BizTalk. And what I'd really like to say is, if this is a topic I'm quite interested in and probably going to do a bit more work on it, but if anybody else out there is doing similar things, or if you're actually doing a real world project and want to share experiences on this, please give me a shout via my blog or Twitter, and it would be great to hear what other people are doing. At the minute I haven't published those 2 tools yet, but I intend to. If you really want to get hold of those tools and I haven't done it yet, please give me a shout and I'll share them with you, or otherwise check my blog for more information. And I hope people have found this video useful.